The dust swirled in the afternoon sun as trucks and trailers lined the gravel road leading to Miller's livestock auction. It was the kind of hot July day that made everything shimmer in the distance, and the smell of hay and horse sweat hung thick in the air. People moved slowly in the heat, their boots crunching on the dry ground as they walked between the holding pens. Looking at the animals that would soon be sold, Jack Morrison parked his old Ford pickup at the far end of the lot, away from the crowd. He wasn't here to socialize. At 58 years old, Jack had been coming to these auctions for more than 30 years, but today felt different. His ranch had been too quiet lately, too empty. Since his wife Rebecca passed away 2 years ago, the silence in the evenings had become almost unbearable. He walked slowly toward the auction barn, his weathered hands tucked deep in his jacket pockets. Jack wasn't a tall man, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his whole life working with animals. His gray hair stuck out from under his favorite baseball cap, and his face showed the deep lines that came from years of squinting into the sun. The auction barn buzzed with conversation as buyers and sellers gathered on the wooden bleachers. Jack found a spot near the back where he could see everything without being noticed. He recognized most of the faces here, ranchers, horse traders, and a few people who just came for the entertainment. The auctioneer, a round man named Tom Bradley, was already warming up his voice, practicing those rapid-fire words that would soon decide the fate of every animal brought here today. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a fine selection for you today," Tom announced through his microphone. "Everything from riding horses to working stock. Let's get started with lot number 1. Jack watched as horse after horse entered the ring. Some were young and spirited, dancing nervously as their handlers tried to keep them calm. Others were older, steady animals that stood quietly while potential buyers examined them. The bidding was brisk for the good horses, the ones with papers, the ones trained for specific jobs, the ones that could make someone money. As the afternoon wore on, Jack began to wonder why he had come. Nothing here felt right. He was looking for something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was just an excuse to get away from the empty house, from the memories that seemed to echo in every room. Then lot number 47 was called. The gate swung open, and a chestnut mare walked into the ring. She was beautiful. There was no doubt about that. Her coat gleamed like polished copper, and she had the kind of elegant build that spoke of good bloodlines. But there was something in her eyes that made Jack sit up straighter in his seat. While the other horses had shown fear or excitement or anger, this mare looked simply tired. Defeated, even. "Here we have a 9-year-old quarter horse mare," Tom called out, reading from his clipboard. "Good conformation, gentle temperament. Now, folks, I need to tell you that this mare is being sold as barren. 3 breeding seasons with no success. But she'd make a fine riding horse for someone looking for a calm, steady mount." The word barren seemed to hang in the air like a death sentence. Jack watched as several potential bidders who had been leaning forward suddenly sat back in their seats. In the horse business, a mare that couldn't produce foals was like a car that couldn't run. She might be beautiful, but she couldn't earn her keep. The mare stood quietly in the center of the ring while Tom waited for bids. Her handler, a teenage boy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, held her lead rope loosely. She didn't fight or fuss. She just stood there with that same tired expression in her dark eyes. "Come on now, folks," Tom urged. "This is a fine animal. Someone's going to get a real bargain here. What am I bid? Do I hear 500? Silence stretched across the barn. A few people shifted in their seats, but no hands went up. Jack felt something twist in his chest as he watched the mare. She reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite place what it was. 400? Tom tried again. 350? Finally, a hand went up near the front. Jack couldn't see who it belonged to, but he heard Tom acknowledge the bid. "Thank you, sir. I have 350. Do I hear 400? Another long pause. Jack found himself studying the mare more closely. Despite what the papers said about her inability to breed, she looked healthy. Her eyes were clear, her coat shiny, her stance alert but relaxed. There was intelligence there, and something else, a gentleness that reminded him of his own Rebecca. "Going once at 350, Tom announced. "This is a steal, folks." "Going twice." Jack's hand shot up before he even realized he was going to bid. 400, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the barn. A few heads turned to look at him, and he could see the surprise on some faces. Jack Morrison wasn't known for buying horses he didn't need, especially not ones that came with problems. "Thank you, Jack," Tom grinned. "I have 400. Do I hear 450? The original bidder hesitated, then shook his head. Jack could see him talking to the man next to him, probably explaining why he wasn't going to waste more money on a barren mare. "For 50? Tom asked the crowd hopefully. 425? When no other bids came, Tom brought down his gavel with a sharp crack. "Sold to Jack Morrison for $400. As the mare was let out of the ring, Jack sat back in his seat, wondering what had just happened. He owned 2 young foals already, Dusty and Storm, whose mother had died giving birth to them last spring. He'd been hand-raising them, and they were doing well, but they certainly didn't need another horse. Especially not one that came with the kind of problems this mare obviously had. But as he made his way down to the office to complete the paperwork, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he'd done the right thing. The mare's previous owners were there, the Henderson family from over in Cascade County. Jack knew them slightly. They ran a decent operation but had been struggling financially for the past few years. Mrs. Henderson looked up as Jack approached, and he could see the mixture of relief and regret in her eyes. "Jack," she said quietly, "I'm glad it's you taking her. We just couldn't afford to keep feeding a horse that couldn't earn her keep." "What's her name?" Jack asked, pulling out his checkbook. "Belle," Mr. Henderson answered. "After the bluebells that grow wild on our place, she always seemed to like grazing near them." Jack nodded, thinking of the bluebells that grew behind his own house, the ones Rebecca had planted their first spring on the ranch. "Belle's a good name," he said simply, as he signed the papers and handed over his check. Jack caught sight of Belle through the window. She was standing quietly in the holding pen, watching the activity around her with those same tired eyes. But for just a moment, when she turned her head toward the window, Jack could have sworn he saw something else there. Hope, maybe. Or perhaps just the recognition that her life was about to change again, walking out to get his truck and trailer. Ready? Jack found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. He had no idea what he was going to do with a barren mare, but somehow that didn't seem to matter. Sometimes he thought the heart knows things that the head can't figure out. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky as Jack loaded Belle into his trailer. She walked up the ramp without hesitation, as if she understood that this was her chance for something better. As he secured the trailer and climbed into his truck, Jack felt a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. The drive home would take about an hour, and for the first time in 2 years, Jack wasn't dreading the arrival at his empty ranch. He had Belle now, and somehow that changed everything. The trailer rattled slightly as Jack pulled into his driveway, the familiar sound of gravel crunching under the truck tires. The evening sun cast long shadows across his property, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. He could see Dusty and Storm in the front pasture, their heads raised high as they caught the scent of the newcomer in the trailer behind them. Jack shut off the engine and sat for a moment, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. What had he done? A practical man his whole life? He just spent $400 on a horse that couldn't do the one thing horses were supposed to do on a working ranch. His neighbors would think he'd lost his mind. Hell, maybe he had, but as he climbed out of the truck and walked around to the back of the trailer, he heard a soft nicker from inside. Belle was talking to him, her voice low and gentle. It was the first sound he'd heard her make, and it sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Easy, girl," he said quietly, unlatching the trailer door. "Welcome home." Belle backed out of the trailer with careful, measured steps. Her hooves touched the ground, and she stood perfectly still for a moment, taking in her new surroundings. Jack held her lead rope loosely, not wanting to pressure her, and watched as she turned her head this way and that, studying everything. With those intelligent dark eyes, the 2 foals in the pasture had moved closer to the fence, their curiosity getting the better of them. Dusty, the bay colt, stretched his neck as far as he could through the fence rails, trying to catch Belle's scent. Storm, a little gray filly, was more cautious but equally interested, standing just behind her brother with her ears pricked forward. "Those are my babies," Jack explained to Belle, even though he felt a little foolish talking to a horse like she could understand every word. "Lost their mama when they were born. Been raising them by hand ever since." Belle's ears flicked toward the sound of his voice, and then she turned to look at the foals. Something changed in her expression then, a softening that Jack couldn't quite describe. She took a step toward the fence, pulling gently on the lead rope. "Want to meet them, do you?" Jack asked, leading her closer to the pasture. When Belle reached the fence, something magical happened. Dusty immediately pushed his nose through the rails toward her, and Belle lowered her head to touch noses with him. The greeting lasted only a few seconds, but Jack could see something pass between them, some kind of understanding that he couldn't put into words. Storm was more hesitant, but after a few minutes of watching Belle and Dusty, she crept forward to investigate the new arrival. Belle stood perfectly still as the little filly sniffed at her through the fence, her whole body language radiating patience and gentleness. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack muttered under his breath. He'd seen a lot of horses in his lifetime, but he'd never seen one show such immediate, natural affection for foals that weren't even her own. After a few more minutes of introductions through the fence, Jack led Belle to the barn. His property wasn't fancy, just 40 acres of rolling pasture, a modest house, and a simple 4-stall barn that he'd built himself 20 years ago. But it was well-maintained and comfortable, the kind of place where a horse could live a good life. Belle's new stall was right next to the large paddock where Dusty and Storm spent their nights. Jack had planned it that way without really thinking about why. Now, as he led Belle into the clean stall with fresh hay and water, he realized his instincts might have been better than his conscious mind. "This is your place now," he told her, removing her halter and hanging it on the hook outside the stall door. "Hope it suits you." Belle immediately went to the water bucket and took a long drink. Then she moved to the hay net and began eating with the methodical patience of a horse who had learned not to take good food for granted. But every few minutes she would lift her head and look toward the paddock where the foals were settling. Down for the night, Jack leaned against the stall door, watching her. In the dim light of the barn, with the soft sounds of horses eating and the familiar smell of hay and leather, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace, maybe, or purpose. He wasn't sure which, but it felt good. The sound of a truck engine in his driveway interrupted his thoughts. Jack walked outside to see his neighbor Bill Patterson climbing out of his pickup. Bill owned the ranch next door, and he was the kind of man who made it his business to know everything. That happened in a 10-mile radius. "Heard you bought yourself a horse at Miller's today," Bill called out, his tone carrying just a hint of amusement. "Thought I'd come see what kind of trouble you got yourself into." Jack sighed internally. News traveled fast in rural Montana, especially when it involved someone doing something unexpected. "Just a mare that needed a home," he said simply. Bill walked over to the barn and peered into Belle's stall. She looked up from her hay, studied him for a moment, then went back to eating. "Pretty animal," Bill admitted. "What's wrong with her?" "Nothing's wrong with her." "Come on, Jack. Nobody sells a mare that looks like that unless there's a problem. What is it, lame? Sick? Crazy?" Jack hesitated. He knew that once he told Bill the truth, it would be all over the county by tomorrow morning. "She can't breed," he said finally. Bill's eyebrows shot up. "Barren? And you bought her anyway?" He shook his head in disbelief. "Jack, I know you've been lonely since Rebecca passed, but buying pets isn't the answer. This is a working ranch, not a retirement home for useless horses." The words stung more than Jack wanted to admit, partly because they echoed his own doubts. But as he looked at Belle, who had moved to the front of her stall and was watching Dusty and Storm with an expression of gentle concern, he felt his resolve strengthen. "She's not useless," he said quietly. "And she's not a pet. She's just a horse that needed someone to believe in her." Bill stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged. Your money, I guess. But don't come crying to me when you realize you can't afford to feed animals that don't earn their keep. After Bill left, Jack remained in the barn for a while longer. He checked on Dusty and Storm, who were lying down in their paddock, and was surprised to see that Belle had positioned herself at the front of her stall where she could see them clearly. Even more surprising, the foals had moved closer to the fence that separated them from her stall, as if they wanted to be near her too. As the last light faded from the sky, Jack finally headed to the house. It was a simple two-bedroom place that he and Rebecca had fixed up together over the years. Nothing fancy, but it had always been home. Since Rebecca's death, though, it had felt more like a place he slept than a place he lived. Tonight felt different. As Jack heated up a can of soup for dinner, he found himself looking out the kitchen window toward the barn. He could see the soft glow of the security light he'd left on, and he knew that Belle was out there, probably still watching over those two foals like a guardian angel. Maybe Bill was right. Maybe he had lost his mind. Maybe buying a barren mare was the act of a lonely old man who wasn't thinking straight. But as Jack sat down to eat his simple dinner, he realized he didn't care what anyone else thought. For the first time in 2 years, his ranch felt alive again. For the first time since Rebecca died, he had something to look forward to in the morning. Outside, the Montana night settled over the ranch with its familiar sounds, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of wind through the grass, the soft snorts and shifting of horses in the barn. But tonight, there was something new in that mix of sounds. Tonight, there was the quiet presence of a mare named Belle, who had already begun to change everything just by being there. Jack finished his soup and headed to bed, but he left the curtains open so he could see the barn from his bedroom window. As he drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of Belle's gentle eyes and the way she had looked at those two motherless foals. Maybe, just maybe, they all needed each other more than any of them realized. The first week with Belle passed like a gentle dream. Jack woke each morning to find her standing at the front of her stall, watching Dusty and Storm as they played in their paddock. She would nicker softly when she saw him coming, a sound that had quickly become one of his favorite parts of the day. By the third day, Jack made a decision that surprised even himself. He opened the gate between Belle's stall and the foal's paddock, creating one large space where they could all be together. He stood back, holding his breath, not sure what would happen when a strange mare met two young horses, who had never known a mother's care. What happened next would stay with Jack for the rest of his life. Belle walked slowly into the paddock, her movements careful and deliberate. Dusty and Storm froze, unsure whether to approach or run. For a long moment, the three horses simply looked at each other. Then Belle did something that made Jack's throat tighten with emotion. She lowered her head and made a soft rumbling sound deep in her chest, the same sound mother horses used to call their babies. Dusty, always the braver of the two, took a tentative step forward. Belle remained perfectly still as the young colt approached, letting him investigate her scent and her presence at his own pace. When he finally touched his nose to her neck, Belle gently nuzzled him back, running her muzzle along his face in the way a mother would groom her foal. Storm took longer to warm up, but Belle's patience seemed endless. She would stand quietly, while the filly watched from a distance, occasionally making that soft maternal sound that seemed to say, "I'm here when you're ready." By the end of the week, both foals were following Belle around the paddock like shadows. She had somehow known exactly what they needed, not just companionship, but the kind of guidance and protection that only a mother could provide. Jack called his veterinarian, Dr. Lisa Chun, to come check on Belle and give her a clean bill of health for her new home. Dr. Chun had been treating Jack's animals for almost 15 years, and she was one of the few people whose opinion he truly valued. "So this is the famous Belle," Dr. Chun said, with a smile as she set up her equipment in the barn. "Word's already gotten around about your mysterious mare." Jack felt his cheeks warm slightly. "People have too much time on their hands around." "Here," Dr. Chun laughed. "Maybe, but I have to say I'm curious myself. A barren mare who cost you $400. That's not like you, Jack." As Dr. Chun examined Belle, checking her heart rate, temperature, and overall condition, Jack found himself watching the foals. They had positioned themselves just outside the stall, clearly worried about their adopted mother. Every few minutes, one of them would whinny softly, and Belle would respond with a reassuring nicker. "Her vital signs are excellent," Dr. Chun announced, running her hands along Belle's legs to check for any swelling or injury. "Coat's shiny, eyes are bright, muscle tone is good. Whatever problems she had at her previous home, she seems to be thriving here. She's been eating well," Jack said. "Never seen a horse settle in so fast." Dr. Chun moved to examine Belle's teeth and gums, but she paused when she noticed the interaction between Belle and the foals. "How long have they been together?" she asked. "About a week." "Why? I've never seen anything quite like this," Dr. Chun said slowly. "The way she's responding to them, the way they're responding to her. It's like she really is their mother. The bonding is remarkable." As if to prove her point, Storm suddenly let out a sharp whinny of distress. Jack looked over to see that the young filly had gotten her leg tangled in the fence wire while trying to get closer to Belle, before Jack could even move. Belle had pushed past Dr. Chun and was at the stall door, calling urgently to her adopted daughter. "Easy, Storm," Jack said, quickly opening the stall door. Belle immediately rushed to the filly's side, positioning her body between Storm and the fence while Jack carefully freed the caught leg. "She's fine," Jack assured Belle, who was sniffing Storm all over, checking for injuries. "Just a little scared." But Belle wasn't satisfied until she had thoroughly examined Storm herself. She ran her muzzle over every inch of the filly's leg, then gently nudged Storm away from the fence toward the center of the paddock, where it was safer. Dr. Chun watched the entire scene with fascination. "Jack, I've been a veterinarian for 20 years, and I've never seen a horse show such strong maternal instincts toward foals that aren't her own. This is extraordinary." "She's just a good horse," Jack said, but he felt a swell of pride at the doctor's words. "It's more than that," Dr. Chun insisted. "The way she knew exactly how to handle that situation, the way those foals trust her completely. She's not just caring for them, she's actually teaching them." Over the next few weeks, Jack began to see what Dr. Chun meant. Belle seemed to have an instinctive understanding of what Dusty and Storm needed to learn to survive and thrive. She taught them which plants were safe to eat and which to avoid, guiding them away from the bitter weeds that grew along the fence line and leading them to the sweetest grass. When a thunderstorm rolled through the valley one night, Jack found all 3 horses huddled together in the barn, with Belle positioned protectively over the 2 foals. During the worst of the lightning and thunder, she kept them calm with soft nickers and gentle nudges, showing them that they were safe. Belle also taught them about danger. When a coyote appeared at the edge of the pasture one evening, she immediately moved between the foals and the threat, her body tense and alert. She didn't run or panic. She simply stood her ground until the coyote decided to look for easier prey elsewhere. "She's made them braver," Jack told Dr. Chun during a follow-up visit. Before Belle came, those foals would spook at their own shadows. Now they're confident, curious. They know they have someone looking out for them. Dr. Chun was taking notes, clearly fascinated by what she was observing. "Have you given any thought to Belle's previous breeding difficulties?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "Well, sometimes a mare's inability to conceive isn't about physical problems. Stress, poor nutrition, inadequate care, these can all affect fertility. Belle is clearly healthy now, and she's obviously got strong maternal instincts. I wonder if her previous environment just wasn't right for her." Jack hadn't thought about it that way. He remembered the Henderson family's struggling ranch, the financial pressures they'd been under. Maybe Belle's problem hadn't been that she couldn't be a mother, but that she'd never been given the right conditions to succeed. As autumn settled over the ranch, Jack established new routines that included all 3 horses. Morning feeding became a family affair, with Belle making sure both foals got their share while teaching them proper manners around food. Evening turnout was equally organized, with Belle leading the small herd to different parts of the pasture, showing them where the best grazing could be found. The changes in Dusty and Storm were remarkable. They grew stronger and more confident each day, their coats gleaming with health, their eyes bright with curiosity. But more than that, they had learned how to be horses. They knew how to communicate with each other, how to establish boundaries, how to find comfort in the presence of their herd. Jack often found himself standing at the fence in the evenings, watching the three of them graze together in the golden light. Belle would keep one eye on her charges while she ate, always aware of where they were and what they were doing. If one wandered too far, she would call them back with a gentle nicker. If they got into mischief, she would pin her ears and give them a look that immediately corrected their behavior. "You know what I think?" Dr. Chun said during one of her visits, watching Belle guide Storm away from a puddle of muddy water. "I think Belle wasn't barren at all. I think she was just waiting for the right family to mother." Jack smiled, running his hand along the fence rail. "Maybe so, Doc, maybe so." As winter approached, Jack realized that his quiet ranch had become something entirely different. It was no longer just a place where he lived alone with his memories. It had become a home again, filled with life and purpose and the kind of family bonds that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with love. Spring came early to Montana that year, arriving with warm winds that melted the last patches of snow and painted the hillsides green almost overnight. Jack had always loved this time of year, when the ranch seemed to wake up from its winter. Sleep and everything felt fresh and full of possibility. But this spring felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't quite explain. It started with small things. Belle began eating more than usual, finishing her hay and grain with an appetite that surprised Jack. She had always been a good eater, but now she seemed almost hungry all the time. At first, he wondered if she was just enjoying the fresh grass that was beginning to sprout in the pastures. Then he noticed changes in her behavior. Belle had always been gentle with Dusty and Storm, but now she seemed even more protective, keeping them closer to her side when they grazed and becoming visibly anxious if they wandered too far. She would call to them more frequently, that soft, maternal nicker becoming an almost constant soundtrack to their days. One morning in late March, Jack was filling the water troughs when he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Belle was standing perfectly still in the center of the pasture while Dusty and Storm pressed their ears against her sides, listening intently. Their expressions were focused, almost mystified, as if they were hearing something Jack couldn't detect. "What are you two up to?" Jack called out, but the foals didn't move. They stayed pressed against Belle's flanks, their eyes wide with what looked like wonder. That evening, Jack mentioned the strange behavior to his neighbor Bill Patterson, who had stopped by to borrow a fence post digger. Bill was examining Belle through the fence, his experienced rancher's eye taking in every detail of her appearance. "You know, Jack," Bill said slowly, "this mare looks different than she did when you brought her home." "Different how? Her belly's rounder? And her flanks are filling out." Bill studied Belle for another long moment. "When's the last time you had the vet check her over?" Jack felt his heart skip a beat. "You think she's sick?" "I think you better call Dr. Chun," Bill said quietly. "And Jack, you might want to ask her to do a pregnancy check." "That's impossible," Jack protested. "She's barren. That's why I got her so cheap." But even as he said the words, Jack found himself really looking at Belle for the first time in weeks. Her sides did seem fuller, and there was something different about the way she carried herself. A new roundness to her belly that hadn't been there before. That night, Jack barely slept. He kept thinking about the way Dusty and Storm had been listening to Belle's sides, about her increased appetite, about the protective way she'd been acting. By morning, he'd convinced himself he was imagining things, but he called Dr. Chun anyway. "I can be there this afternoon," Dr. Chun said when Jack explained his concerns. "But Jack, you know the chances of this are pretty slim, right? She was examined thoroughly by vets at her previous home." "I know," Jack said, "but something's different about her. I can't put my finger on what, but something's changed." Dr. Chun arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, her truck loaded with the portable ultrasound equipment she used for pregnancy checks. Jack met her at the barn, his hands shaking slightly as he led Belle into the examination stall. "How long has she been showing these signs?" Dr. Chun asked as she prepared her equipment. "About 2 weeks, maybe 3. At first I thought she was just enjoying the spring grass." Belle stood calmly as Dr. Chun began her examination, starting with the basics: heart rate, temperature, overall condition. Then came the moment Jack had been both hoping for and dreading. Dr. Chun applied the ultrasound gel to Belle's side and placed the probe against her belly. For a long moment, Dr. Chun stared at the small screen, her expression unreadable. Jack held his breath, watching her face for any sign of what she might be seeing. "Jack," Dr. Chun said softly, her voice filled with amazement, "you need to look at this." Jack moved closer to the screen, but the black and white images meant nothing to him. "What am I looking at?" "That," Dr. Chun pointed to a small, moving shape on the screen, "is a heartbeat." "Jack, Belle is pregnant." "About 3 months along, I'd say." The world seemed to tilt around Jack. He stared at the screen, watching the tiny rhythmic movement that Dr. Chun had identified as a heartbeat. "Are you sure?" "Positive. See this here? That's the foal's head, and here's a leg." Dr. Chun moved the probe slightly, and the image shifted to show different angles of the developing baby. "This is a healthy, viable pregnancy." Jack had to sit down on the feed bucket behind him. "But how? She was diagnosed as barren." 3 different breeding seasons with no success." Dr. Chun shook her head in wonder. "Sometimes these things happen, Jack. Maybe the stress of her previous situation was preventing conception. Maybe her nutrition wasn't adequate. Or maybe," she paused, looking at Belle with new respect, "maybe she was just waiting for the right home." As if sensing the importance of the moment, Belle turned her head to look at Jack. Her dark eyes seemed to hold a quiet satisfaction, as if she'd been keeping a wonderful secret and was finally ready to share it. "When?" Jack managed to ask. "When is she due?" "Based on what I'm seeing here, I'd say late July or early August. We'll need to monitor her closely, especially given her age and her history, but right now everything looks perfect." The news hit Jack like a thunderbolt. In 4 months, Belle would give birth. The mare, who had been labeled barren, who had been sold for practically nothing because she couldn't produce a foal, was going to become a mother dot as Dr. Chun packed up her equipment. Jack found himself staring at Belle with new eyes. No wonder Dusty and Storm had been acting strange, pressing their ears to her sides. They had been listening to their new sibling's heartbeat, somehow sensing the life growing inside their adopted mother. "Jack, I have to ask," Dr. Chun said as she loaded her truck. "Do you have any idea who the father might be?" Jack thought back to Belle's first weeks on his ranch. He'd kept her separate from other horses except for Dusty and Storm, both too young to breed. But then he remembered his neighbor Tom Richards, whose stallion sometimes grazed in the pasture that bordered Jack's property. "There's a stallion next door," Jack said slowly. "Thunder. He's got a tendency to jump fences when the mood strikes him." Dr. Chun nodded. That would explain it. A stallion can be very determined when he sets his mind on something. After Dr. Chun left, Jack sat on his porch steps, trying to absorb what he'd just learned. Belle was going to have a baby. The impossible had happened, and in a few months, his little family of 3 would become 4 as evening approached. Jack walked out to the pasture where Belle was grazing with Dusty and Storm. The 2 foals seemed different now that Jack knew their secret. They stayed even closer to Belle than before, occasionally nuzzling her sides where their baby brother or sister was growing. "So you've been keeping secrets from me," Jack said to Belle, running his hand along her neck. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Belle whickered softly and bumped his shoulder with her nose, as if to say she'd been waiting for the right moment. That night, Jack called his sister Margaret in Billings to share the news. Margaret had always thought he was a little crazy for buying a barren mare, but she'd been supportive in her own way. "A baby?" Margaret's voice was filled with delight. "Jack, that's wonderful news." "I still can't believe it," Jack admitted. 6 months ago, nobody wanted her? Now she's going to be a mother." "Maybe that's exactly what she needed," Margaret said. Sometimes all any of us need is someone to believe in us. As Jack hung up the phone, he looked out his kitchen window toward the barn. Belle was visible in the moonlight, standing peacefully, with Dusty and Storm on either side of her like bookends. In 4 months, there would be a new addition to their family. A foal that nobody had expected, from a mare that everyone had given up on. The impossible was about to become reality, and Jack couldn't wait to see what other miracles Belle had in store for them. News traveled fast in rural Montana, especially when it involved something as unusual as a supposedly barren mare turning up pregnant. By the end of the week, it seemed like half the county had heard about Belle's miracle pregnancy. Jack first realized how far the word had spread when he stopped at Miller's feed store to pick up grain and found himself the center of attention. "Well, if it isn't the man with the magic mare," called out Pete Wilson from behind the counter. Pete had run the feed store for 30 years and knew everyone within 50 miles. "Heard you got yourself a real surprise out at your place." Jack felt his cheeks warm as several other customers turned to look at him. "News travels fast around here," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "You bet it does," laughed Jim Crawford. "A rancher from over near Great Falls? A barren mare getting pregnant? That's the kind of story people remember." What Jack hadn't expected was the divided reaction his news would receive. Some folks like Pete and Jim seemed genuinely happy for him. They understood that good things didn't happen often enough in the ranching business, and they were willing to celebrate a small miracle when they saw one, but others weren't so sure. When Jack stopped by the post office the next day, he overheard 2 women talking in hushed voices near the counter. "I don't believe it for a minute," one of them was saying. "That mare was examined by 3 different vets. Horses don't just magically become fertile after years of being barren." "Maybe there was some kind of mix-up," the other woman suggested. "Maybe he's got a different mare than he thinks." Jack pretended to be reading his mail, but their words stung more than he wanted to admit. He'd lived in this community his whole life, built a reputation for honesty and straight dealing. To have people questioning his story felt like a personal attack. The situation got worse when the local newspaper, the Valley Reporter, got wind of the story. Jack was feeding the horses on a Tuesday morning when a young reporter named Katie Mills showed up at his gate with a camera and a notebook full of questions. "Mr. Morrison, I'm from the Valley Reporter," she called out cheerfully. "I'd love to do a story about your miracle mare. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Jack's first instinct was to send her away, but Belle chose that moment to walk over to the fence, her rounded belly clearly visible. Katie's eyes widened as she saw the pregnant mare, and Jack realized that refusing to talk would only make people more suspicious. "I suppose you can ask," Jack said reluctantly. Opening the gate to let her into the pasture, Katie turned out to be a decent young woman, asking fair questions and taking respectful photos of Belle with Dusty and Storm. But when the story ran the following week, Jack was shocked by the headline, "Local Mare's Miracle Pregnancy Baffles Experts." The article itself was accurate enough, but something about seeing Belle's story in print made it feel bigger and more complicated than it had when it was just his business. Within days, Jack started getting phone calls from strangers wanting to know more about the miracle mare. Some of the calls were from genuinely interested horse people who had heard similar stories and wanted to share their experiences. But others came from folks who seemed more interested in finding fault than celebrating good news. "There's got to be more to this story," insisted one caller who identified himself as a veterinarian from Bozeman. "Mares don't just overcome fertility problems without medical intervention. What aren't you telling people?" Jack hung up on that one, but the accusation bothered him for days. He found himself second-guessing everything, wondering if people thought he was lying or hiding something important. The controversy reached a peak when Dr. Foster, the veterinarian who had originally diagnosed Belle as barren, drove out to Jack's ranch unannounced. Jack was cleaning stalls when he saw the familiar truck pull up, and his stomach tightened with anxiety. Dr. Foster was an older man, probably close to retirement, with gray hair and the kind of serious expression that made people nervous. He'd been practicing veterinary medicine for 40 years and had a reputation for being thorough, but not particularly warm. "Jack," Dr. Foster nodded curtly as he climbed out of his truck. "Heard some interesting news about that mare you bought." "From the Hendersons, Dr. Foster," Jack replied carefully. "What brings you out this way?" "Professional curiosity, mostly. I'd like to take a look at this mare that's supposedly pregnant. The one I diagnosed as barren just 8 months ago." There was something in the older vet's tone that made Jack bristle, but he led Dr. Foster to the pasture where Belle was grazing with the foals. Belle looked up as they approached, her belly now unmistakably round with pregnancy. Dr. Foster studied her for a long moment, then pulled out a stethoscope and asked Jack to bring her closer to the fence. Belle cooperated calmly as the vet listened to her heartbeat and examined her overall condition. "She certainly looks pregnant," Dr. Foster admitted grudgingly. "But I stand by my original diagnosis. This mare showed no signs of fertility when I examined her. Her reproductive system appeared completely inactive." "Maybe something changed," Jack suggested. "Dr. Chun thinks the stress of her previous situation might have been affecting her ability to conceive." Dr. Foster's expression suggested he didn't think much of that theory. "In 40 years of practice, I've never seen a truly barren mare suddenly become fertile. There has to be another explanation." "Like what?" "Like maybe this isn't the same mare?" Dr. Foster said bluntly. "Maybe there was some kind of mix-up at the auction. Maybe the mare you thought you were buying isn't the one you actually got." Jack felt his temper flare. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. And right now, all I have is your word that this is the same animal I examined 8 months ago." The confrontation might have escalated if Belle hadn't chosen that moment to walk over to the fence and nuzzle Jack's shoulder. Her gentle touch reminded him of what really mattered, not what other people thought, but the truth he could see with his own eyes. "Dr. Foster," Jack said quietly, "I don't know why Belle couldn't get pregnant before, and I don't know why she can now, but I know this is the same mare I bought at Miller's auction, and I know she's carrying a healthy foal. That's enough for me." After Dr. Foster left, Jack sat on his porch steps feeling drained by the encounter. He'd never been the kind of person who enjoyed being in the spotlight, and all this attention was wearing on him. Part of him wished he'd never told anyone about Belle's pregnancy. But then Dusty and Storm came trotting over from the pasture, followed by Belle at her slower, more careful pace. The three of them formed a little group at the fence, looking at Jack with expressions that seemed to say they didn't care what anyone else thought. They knew they were family. That evening, Jack got a phone call that lifted his spirits. It was from an old friend named Robert Hayes who lived over in Whitefish. "Jack, I heard about your mare," Robert said, "and I wanted to tell you something. About 15 years ago, I had a similar situation. Bought a mare that was supposed to be barren, and she ended up giving me 3 beautiful foals over the next 5 years. Really. And I got the same kind of grief you're getting now. People questioning whether it was the same horse, whether I was telling the truth, all that nonsense. But you know what I learned? Sometimes horses know things we don't. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right situation, the right care, the right chance to show what they're capable of." Jack felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Thanks for calling, Robert. I needed to hear that. Don't let the doubters get to you," Robert advised. "You gave that mare a chance when nobody else would. Whatever happens next, you did right by her." After hanging up, Jack walked out to check on Belle one more time before bed. She was standing quietly in the barn, content and peaceful, with Dusty and Storm settled nearby. Her pregnancy was progressing beautifully, and Dr. Chen's regular checkups showed that both mother and foal were healthy. As Jack locked up the barn for the night, he made a decision. He was done worrying about what other people thought. Belle's story was his story, and he was going to see it through with pride, no matter what the doubters said. July arrived with scorching heat that shimmered off the pastures like waves. Belle moved more slowly now, her belly heavy with the foal that would arrive any day. Jack found himself checking on her constantly, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night just to make sure she was comfortable. Dr. Chun had been visiting twice a week for the past month, monitoring Belle's progress with the careful attention of someone who understood how precious this pregnancy was. During her latest visit, she delivered news that made Jack's stomach tighten with worry. "Everything looks good," Dr. Chun had said, running her hands along Belle's swollen sides. "But I want you to understand the risks we're facing here. Belle is 11 years old now, which makes this a high-risk pregnancy. Add to that her history of fertility problems, and we need to be prepared for complications." Jack had nodded, trying to keep his expression calm, but inside he felt like a man walking a tightrope. After all Belle had been through, after the miracle of her getting pregnant at all, the thought of losing her or the foal was almost unbearable. What kind of complications? He'd asked. Difficult labor, mostly. Older mares sometimes have trouble delivering, especially if it's been a while since their last foal. We might need to assist with the birth, or in the worst case, perform emergency surgery. That conversation had been 3 days ago, and Jack hadn't slept well since. He'd moved a cot into the barn so he could be close to Belle during the night. His back ached from sleeping on the narrow bed, but he couldn't bring himself to leave her alone. Belle seemed to sense his anxiety. She would walk over to him when he sat on the cot, resting her heavy head against his shoulder in a gesture of comfort that touched him deeply. Sometimes he wondered who was taking care of whom. Dusty and Storm had appointed themselves as Belle's bodyguards. The 2 young horses rarely left her side now, flanking her like sentries whenever she moved around the pasture. They seemed to understand that something important was about to happen, and their protective behavior had intensified as Belle's due date approached. "They know," Jack told Dr. Chun during one of her visits. "Those 2 know she's close." Dr. Chun watched the trio grazing together, noting how Dusty and Storm positioned themselves on either side of Belle. "Animals often sense these things before we do. They might give you advance warning when labor starts." Jack had installed extra lighting in the barn and set up a comfortable foaling stall with thick bedding and easy access to fresh water. He'd read every book he could find about horse births, though he knew that all the reading in the world couldn't prepare him for the real thing. His neighbor, Bill Patterson, stopped by most evenings now, offering to help with the night watch. Bill had been skeptical about Belle from the beginning, but as her pregnancy progressed, his attitude had shifted to something closer to respect. "Never seen anything quite like this," Bill admitted one evening as they watched Belle slowly making her way to the water trough. "Got to hand it to you, Jack. You saw something in that mare that nobody else did." "I just gave her a chance," Jack replied. "She did the rest herself." "Still, it takes guts to bet on a long shot like that. Most folks would have listened to the experts and moved on." Jack appreciated Bill's words, but praise felt premature when so much could still go wrong. Every morning when he woke up, his first thought was to check if Belle had made it through another night. Every evening when he settled down on his cot, he wondered if this would be the night. The heat wave that had gripped the valley for the past week wasn't helping matters. Belle seemed uncomfortable in the sweltering temperatures, spending most of her time in the shade of the barn overhang. Jack had set up fans to keep air moving through the barn, and he'd been hosing Belle down with cool water twice a day to help her stay comfortable. "Pregnant mares don't handle heat well," Dr. Chun had warned him. "Keep her as cool as possible and watch for signs of distress." On a particularly sweltering Tuesday evening, Jack noticed that Belle wasn't eating her grain. She'd been a good eater throughout her pregnancy, so the untouched feed bucket immediately caught his attention. When he went to check on her, he found her standing in the corner of her stall, shifting her weight from foot to foot in obvious discomfort. "Easy, girl," Jack said softly, entering the stall. "What's wrong?" Belle turned to look at him, and Jack was struck by the expression in her eyes. There was something different there. Not pain exactly, but a kind of focused intensity he hadn't seen before. She nuzzled his hand briefly, then turned away again, her attention drawn inward to something only she could feel. Outside the stall, Dusty and Storm were pacing restlessly. The young horses kept looking toward Belle, then at Jack, as if trying to communicate something urgent. Their behavior was so unusual that Jack decided to call Dr. Chun, even though it was after hours. "She's not eating and she seems uncomfortable," Jack explained when the vet answered her phone. "The foals are acting strange too, like they know something's happening." "It could be early labor," Dr. Chun said. "How's she moving?" "Is she lying down at all?" Jack watched Belle for a moment. "She's standing, but she keeps shifting around. Won't settle. I'm on my way." "This might be it, Jack." After hanging up, Jack felt his heart rate accelerate. This was what he'd been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. He checked his supplies one more time: clean towels, disinfectant, the emergency phone numbers Dr. Chun had given him. Everything was ready except for his nerves. Belle continued her restless movements, occasionally looking back at her sides with an expression of mild confusion. Jack stayed with her, talking quietly and offering the kind of reassurance he hoped was helpful. Outside, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, painting the barn in warm golden light. Dr. Chun arrived just as full darkness settled over the ranch. She moved quickly but calmly, setting up her equipment and examining Belle with practiced efficiency. "She's definitely in early labor," Dr. Chun confirmed. "Could be several hours yet, but this is the real thing." Jack felt a mixture of excitement and terror wash over him. After months of waiting and worrying, Belle was finally going to have her baby. The impossible was about to become reality. "What do we do now?" Jack asked. "We wait," Dr. Chun said simply, "and we watch. Belle knows what she's doing, but we need to be ready to help if she needs us." As if they understood the importance of the moment, Dusty and Storm had positioned themselves just outside Belle's stall, maintaining their vigil with the patience of experienced midwives. The barn fell into a hushed quiet, broken only by the soft sounds of Belle's movement and the distant call of night birds. Jack settled onto his cot, knowing that sleep was impossible now. This was the night he'd been preparing for, the night that would determine whether Belle's miracle pregnancy would end in joy or heartbreak. All he could do was be there for her, just as she had been there for Dusty and Storm when they needed a mother's care. The long night stretched ahead of them, full of hope and possibility and the kind of fear that comes with caring deeply about something precious and fragile. The storm rolled in just after midnight, announcing itself with distant rumbles of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the barn walls. Jack looked up from his cot where he'd been dozing fitfully, immediately alert to any change in Belle's condition. She was still standing in her stall, but her restlessness had increased, and she kept looking back at her sides with growing urgency. Lightning flickered outside the barn windows, followed by the sharp crack of thunder that was much closer now. Belle's ears flicked nervously at the sound, and she let out a low whinny that brought Dusty and Storm to immediate attention. The two young horses pressed closer to her stall, their eyes wide with concern. "Easy, girl," Jack said softly, moving to Belle's side. "Just a little weather. Nothing to worry about." But Belle wasn't listening to his reassurances anymore. Her attention had turned completely inward, focused on the powerful forces working within her body. Dr. Chun, who had been napping in a chair near the barn entrance, was instantly awake and moving toward the stall. "Her water just broke," Dr. Chun announced, pointing to the clear fluid that had suddenly appeared on the stall floor. "This is it, Jack. The foal's coming." The next few minutes passed in a blur of organized activity. Dr. Chun quickly examined Belle, confirming that labor was progressing normally, while Jack made sure all their supplies were within easy reach. Outside, the storm was building to full intensity, with rain beginning to hammer against the barn roof. "First stage looks good," Dr. Chun reported, washing her hands thoroughly. "But remember, this is where things can get complicated with older mares. We need to watch for any signs of distress." Belle began the ancient dance of labor, walking in slow circles around her stall, occasionally stopping to paw at the ground or look back at her sides. Jack had read about this behavior, but seeing it in person was both fascinating and nerve-wracking. Every movement seemed to require tremendous effort, and he could see the strain beginning to show in Belle's eyes. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Belle's contractions were becoming more intense, visible as waves of tension that rippled across her sides. She would stop moving during each contraction, her whole body focused on the monumental task of bringing new life into the world. "How long should this take?" Jack asked, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "Every mare is different, Doctor," Chun replied, never taking her eyes off Belle. "Could be quick, could take hours. We just have to let her set the pace." As if responding to the vet's words, Belle suddenly lay down heavily in the thick bedding. This was the position Jack had been hoping to see lying on her side, her body finally able to work with gravity instead of against it. But something in Dr. Chin's expression made his stomach tighten with concern. "What is it?" Jack asked. "She's been pushing for a while now, but I don't see any progress. Sometimes with older mares, the muscles just don't work as efficiently as they should." Outside, the storm reached its peak intensity. Lightning illuminated the barn windows in stark white flashes, followed immediately by thunderclaps that shook the building. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness except for the battery-powered lanterns Jack had set up around the stall. Belle gave a low groan that seemed to come from the depths of her being, and Jack could see her straining with everything she had. But still, no foal appeared. Dr. Chun moved closer, her examination confirming what Jack was beginning to fear. "The foal's positioned wrong," Dr. Chun said quietly. "One leg is bent back. Belle can't deliver like this." "What do we do? I need to correct the position manually." "It's going to be difficult, especially in these conditions, but it's the only way." What followed was the longest hour of Jack's life. Working by lantern light while the storm raged outside, Dr. Chun carefully maneuvered her arm into position to help guide the foal into the proper birth position. Belle continued her laboring, trusting these humans who were trying to help her, even though the procedure was clearly uncomfortable. "Got it," Dr. Chun finally announced, relief clear in her voice. "The leg is positioned correctly now. Next contraction. Should do it." Jack held his breath as Belle pushed again, this time with visible results. First came 2 small hooves, then a nose, then suddenly the entire head of the foal emerged. Belle rested for a moment, gathering strength for the final push that would bring her baby fully into the world. "Come on, Belle," Jack whispered. "You can do this." With a tremendous effort that seemed to use every ounce of strength she possessed, Belle pushed one final time. The foal slipped free in a rush, landing on the thick bedding and a tangle of long legs and wet hair. For a terrifying moment, the newborn lay perfectly still. Jack's heart stopped as he waited for some sign of life. Then the foal lifted its head, shook it once, and let out a small but strong whinny that announced its arrival to the world. "It's a colt," Dr. Chun said with a grin, quickly clearing the foal's nostrils and mouth, "and he's perfect." Belle immediately turned to her baby, her exhaustion forgotten as maternal instincts took over. She began licking him clean with long strokes of her tongue, nickering softly in the way mothers do when welcoming their children to the world. The storm outside seemed to quiet, as if nature itself was acknowledging the miracle that had just occurred. In the small barn, Jack sat back on his heels, watching Belle tend to her newborn son, and felt tears of relief and joy streaming down his face. "Look at that," Dr. Chun marveled, watching the interaction between mother and foal. "She knows exactly what to do." Within minutes, the colt was struggling to stand on his impossibly long legs. He fell down twice, but Belle encouraged him with gentle nudges and soft whinnies. On his third attempt, he managed to get all 4 legs under him and stood swaying beside his mother. Already searching for his first meal, Dusty and Storm had been silent witnesses to the entire birth, but now they both let out welcoming whinnies to their new family member. The colt's ears perked up at the sound, and he turned toward them with curiosity, as if wondering who these other horses might be. "What are you going to call him?" Dr. Chun asked as she cleaned up her equipment. Jack looked at the colt, who was now nursing successfully from his mother. Born during a fierce storm, after a pregnancy that no one thought was possible, this little horse represented hope in its purest form. "Hope," Jack said without hesitation. His name is Hope. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the sky in soft pastels, Jack stood at the stall door watching his expanded family. Belle looked tired but content, occasionally nuzzling her son as he slept curled up in the bedding beside her. Dusty and Storm had settled down just outside the stall, maintaining their protective watch over the newest member of their herd. The impossible had happened. The mare everyone had given up on had successfully delivered a healthy foal. Against all odds, in the middle of a thunderstorm, new life had triumphed. Jack had never been more proud of any animal in his life than he was of Belle at that moment. The long night was over, and a new chapter in their story was just beginning. 1 year later, Jack stood at the same fence where he'd first introduced Belle to Dusty and Storm, watching a scene that still took his breath away. Hope, now a strong and confident yearling, was racing around the pasture with the boundless energy that only young horses possess. His coat had turned a beautiful chestnut color, almost identical to his mother's, but with distinctive white markings on his face and legs that made him unmistakable. Belle grazed peacefully nearby, keeping one eye on her son's antics while maintaining the calm authority of an experienced mother. Dusty and Storm, now fully grown at 3 years old, had taken on the role of protective older siblings, occasionally joining Hope in his games, but always ready to step in if his enthusiasm got him into trouble. The transformation of Jack's small ranch had been remarkable. What had started as a quiet refuge for a lonely widower and 2 orphaned foals had become something much more significant. Word of Belle's story had spread far beyond the borders of their small Montana county, bringing visitors from across the region who wanted to see the miracle mare and her impossible foal. Dr. Chun had documented Belle's case for several veterinary journals, contributing to a growing understanding of how environmental factors could affect equine fertility. Her careful records of Belle's pregnancy and delivery had helped other veterinarians better assist mares with similar histories. "You know," Dr. Chun said during one of her routine visits, "I've had 3 other cases this year where supposedly barren mares conceived after being moved to better conditions. Belle's story is inspiring people to give second chances to horses they might have written off." Jack felt a deep satisfaction knowing that Belle's journey was helping other horses find new homes and new hope. But for him, the most meaningful change was personal. His ranch was alive again, filled with purpose and the kind of family bonds that had nothing to do with blood, and everything to do with love. The doubters had mostly gone quiet after Hope's successful birth. Even Dr. Foster, the veterinarian who had originally diagnosed Belle as barren, had stopped by to see the foal and acknowledged that sometimes the impossible did happen. His visit had been awkward but necessary, a grudging admission that veterinary science didn't have all the answers. "I've never been happier to be wrong about something," Dr. Foster had admitted, watching Hope nurse from his mother. "This colt is living proof that we still have a lot to learn about these animals." The ranch had also become an unofficial sanctuary for other horses that needed second chances. Jack had expanded his facilities to accommodate 3 additional mares that had been destined for slaughter before he intervened. Like Belle, they were older animals whose value wasn't immediately obvious to most buyers, but Jack had learned to see potential where others saw problems. One of the new arrivals was a 20-year-old mare named Daisy who had been retired from ranch work due to arthritis. She couldn't do heavy labor anymore, but she had proven to be an excellent companion for the younger horses, teaching them manners and serving as a calming influence when they got too excited. Another was Rosie, a mare who had been surrendered by owners who could no longer afford to care for her. She had arrived thin and nervous, but under Jack's patient care, she had blossomed into a confident, healthy horse who served as an aunt figure to Hope and the other young animals on the ranch. The local community had embraced Jack's expanded mission. The feed store gave him discounts on supplies, neighbors donated hay and equipment, and the veterinary costs were partially covered by a fund that had been started by people who had heard Belle's story and wanted to help. "You've started something special here," his sister Margaret told him during one of her visits from Billings. "This place has become a symbol of hope for people as much as for horses." Jack understood what she meant. In a world where animals were often valued only for their economic potential, his ranch had become a place where intrinsic worth mattered more than productivity. Visitors often left with tears in their eyes, touched by the sight of horses who had been given second chances thriving in an environment built on patience and care. The story had attracted attention from a regional television station, which had produced a short documentary about Belle and Jack's sanctuary. The piece had aired during the evening news, bringing even more visitors and support to the ranch. But for all the external recognition, Jack's greatest joy remained the simple pleasure of his daily routines with the horses. Every morning he would walk out to the pasture and be greeted by Belle's gentle nicker, Hope's enthusiastic whinny, and the calm presence of Dusty and Storm. Every evening he would stand at the fence and watch them graze together as the sun set over the Montana hills. Hope had grown into a remarkable young horse, inheriting his mother's gentle temperament but adding his own spirited personality to the mix. He was curious about everything, friendly with visitors, and showed signs of the same intelligence that made Belle so special. Several people had already expressed interest in purchasing him, but Jack had politely declined all offers. "He belongs here," Jack would tell potential buyers. "This is his family." The ranch had also become a popular destination for school groups and youth organizations. Jack had developed a simple program where children could learn about horse care and hear Belle's story. Many of the young visitors left with a new understanding of how second chances could transform lives. Dr. Chun had been working with Jack to document the behavioral patterns of their unique herd. The relationship between Belle, Dusty, Storm, and Hope represented something rare in the horse world, a family unit formed by choice rather than blood, held together by bonds of affection and mutual care. "What you've created here is remarkable," Dr. Chun told Jack during one of their conversations. "It's not just about rescuing individual animals. You've shown how the right environment can help any creature reach their full potential." As Jack approached his 60th birthday, he often reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that hot afternoon at Miller's auction. The loneliness that had consumed him after Rebecca's death had been replaced by a sense of purpose that got him up every morning with enthusiasm. The ranch had become his legacy, a place where the cast-offs and the forgotten could find new life. Belle's story had proven that labels like barren or worthless were often just temporary conditions that could be overcome with patience, care, and belief. Standing at the fence in the golden light of evening, watching Hope play with his adoptive siblings while Belle supervised from nearby, Jack felt a profound sense of completion. He had saved Belle from an uncertain fate at that livestock auction, but in return, she had saved him from a life of isolation and regret. The miracle hadn't been just Belle's pregnancy. It had been the transformation of a quiet ranch into a place of healing and hope. It had been the creation of a family that defied conventional definitions but embodied the deepest truths about love and belonging. As the last light faded from the sky and the horses settled in for the night, Jack made his final rounds, checking water and securing gates. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to help animals in need. But tonight, all was well in their small corner of Montana, where impossible dreams had become beautiful reality. The mare who had been sold as barren had indeed brought new life to the ranch, not just in the form of hope, but in the renewal of purpose and joy that had transformed everything she touched.